Hey there, friends. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our stories. Grab a cozy blanket, maybe a cup of tea, and settle in because tonight, I'm going to take you on a magical journey. Let's dive right into the story. I still remember those summer nights at Grandma Evelyn's old farmhouse in the hills of West Virginia. The wooden porch creaked beneath our feet, and the fireflies blinked like scattered stars across the darkened field. But the real magic happened when Grandma would settle into her favorite rocking chair, wrap herself in her hand-knitted shawl, and begin to speak in her soft, melodic American accent. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of ancient secrets. "Did I ever tell you about the whispering winds of Elder Moor?" she'd begin, her blue eyes shimmering with memory. We'd lean in, captivated. She told us the wind wasn't just air moving through trees. It was a spirit, an old one, older than the hills themselves. According to the legend, the winds carried the voices of those long gone, whispering forgotten stories to anyone brave enough to listen. "There was a young girl once," Grandma said, her fingers tracing the lines of her old silver ring. "Her name was Alara. She lived in a village that no longer exists, lost to time. Every night, she'd hear the winds calling her name soft, like a lullaby. The wind," Grandma explained, was searching for something or someone. Alara, curious and fearless, followed its call one moonlit night, deep into the forest where the trees seemed to hum with ancient magic. She walked until she reached the Mirror Lake, Grandma's voice lowered to a near whisper. There she saw something strange. The water didn't reflect the sky. Instead it showed another world, a place where shadows danced and forgotten souls waited. Alara reached out, but before she could touch the water, the wind spoke clearly for the first time. "Not yet." Grandma paused, letting the words hang in the air, the crickets filling the silence. "They say Alara became a guardian of that place, standing between our world and the one beyond the lake." We sat in stunned silence, the wind outside suddenly sounding less like a breeze and more like distant whispers. Before heading to bed, I asked her, "Grandma, do you think the whispering winds are real?" She smiled, that knowing, secretive smile of hers. "Sometimes," she said softly, "when the wind calls your name, it's best not to answer." I remember the first time I stayed with Grandma Evelyn for an entire summer. My parents were going through a rough patch, and they thought sending me to the old family farm in West Virginia might be good for everyone. I was 12, restless and skeptical about spending 3 months in a creaky old house with no internet. But by the end of that summer, I would believe in things I could never explain. Grandma Evelyn's house was like something out of a forgotten storybook. Weathered gray wood, ivy crawling up the porch posts, and a rusting wind chime that sang a lonely tune whenever the breeze swept through the valley. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the dirt road, and at night, the only light came from the stars and the flickering lantern Grandma always kept by the window. From the moment I arrived, I felt something strange about the place. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and rain-soaked earth, and the wind, God, the wind, never seemed to stop moving through the trees. It didn't howl or whistle. It whispered, soft and urgent, as though it were sharing secrets only the hills could understand. The first story she ever told me happened on my second night there. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, the sky painted in strokes of amber and violet. She was shelling peas with practiced hands while I stared at the horizon, wondering if my parents were thinking about me. "Do you know why the wind never rests here?" she asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was low and steady, like the hum of the old rocking chair beneath her. I shook my head, intrigued despite myself. "They say the wind here is alive." She paused, her eyes fixed on the distant hills as if she could see something I couldn't. "Not just moving air. Something more. Something ancient." I raised an eyebrow, trying to seem unimpressed. "Like a ghost." She smiled faintly. "Not quite. A spirit, maybe. Older than ghosts. Older than time." She set the bowl of peas aside and leaned forward, her eyes glittering with that strange, knowing light she always seemed to have when she told her stories. "There's a legend about a girl named Maeve," she began. "A long time ago, when this land was still wild and untamed, Maeve lived in a village nestled deep in these hills. She was different, quiet, thoughtful, always listening to the wind as if it were speaking directly to her. According to Grandma, the people in Maeve's village feared the wind. They said it carried the voices of the lost, souls trapped between this world and the next. They called it the calling breeze. People warned Maeve to stay indoors when the wind howled after dark, but she never listened. One autumn night, the wind grew fierce, tugging at the shutters and moaning like a wounded animal. Maeve's mother bolted the doors, but when she went to check on her daughter, Maeve was gone. They found her footprints leading into the forest, Grandma whispered. But they only went so far. And then they vanished. I felt a chill creep up my spine despite the warm night air. What happened to her? I asked. No one knows, Grandma said. Some say the wind took her. Others believe she became the wind, forever wandering the hills, searching for something or someone. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps, and the wind outside seemed to whisper just a little louder. By the time morning came, I was convinced it was all just an old folktale meant to scare kids like me. But the next week I found something strange while exploring the woods behind the house. An old stone circle half buried in moss and dirt, the stones worn smooth by time and weather. In the center was a shallow, hollowed-out stone basin filled with water, though it hadn't rained in days. As I bent down to touch the cool water, the wind rose suddenly sharp and cold. It whispered something I couldn't understand, like words in an ancient, forgotten language. I ran back to the house, breathless and shaken. That night, Grandma found me sitting on the porch, still rattled. She didn't ask what was wrong. She never did. She just handed me a cup of warm chamomile tea and sat beside me. You found the stones, didn't you? She asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak. Her expression grew distant, almost sad. That's where Maeve was last seen. I stared at her, unable to believe it. But that was just a story. Grandma smiled faintly. Every story has a seed of truth. The wind remembers. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of long hot days and restless nights. I never went back to the stone circle, though sometimes when the wind blew just right, I thought I heard a voice calling my name. On my last night at the farm, the wind rose stronger than ever, shaking the windows and moaning through the trees. As I lay in bed I heard it, clear and unmistakable, my name carried on the breeze. I shot up, heart pounding. For a moment I thought about ignoring it, but something deep inside me knew I couldn't. I grabbed the old lantern by the window and crept outside. The wind pulled at my hair and clothes, tugging me toward the forest's edge. The stars blazed brighter than I'd ever seen, illuminating the familiar path toward the stone circle. I don't know what I expected to find, but when I reached the clearing the wind stopped. Everything was still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then from the shadows beyond the stones, I heard her voice. Soft, familiar, welcoming. I never went back home. They found my empty bed the next morning, sheets twisted and cold. My parents came back from the city, desperate and broken, combing through the hills with search parties, dogs, and local volunteers. They scoured every hollow and creek bed, called my name until their voices cracked, but the forest never gave up its secrets. Grandma Evelyn never joined the search. She just sat on the porch in her old rocking chair, her shawl pulled tight around her frail shoulders, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. When people asked why she wasn't out helping, she only said, "The wind knows where they are." Days stretched into weeks. The search was eventually called off. A tragic accident, the sheriff told my parents. Maybe the river took her. Maybe she got lost. But Grandma only shook her head. She's not gone, she whispered. Not lost. Just elsewhere. Elsewhere. That's the only way I can explain where I went. When I followed the wind into the forest that night, I expected, well, I don't know what I expected. Maybe to see Maeve standing in the clearing, pale and ghostly, or the stone circle glowing with some ancient magic. But when I reached the clearing, there was only silence. The air was thick with stillness, not even a rustle of leaves. I was about to turn back when I noticed the water in the stone basin shimmering faintly under the moonlight. It was perfectly still like a mirror, but its reflection wasn't right. The stars in the water seemed brighter, sharper, almost alive. Someone moved behind me. I spun around but saw nothing. When I turned back toward the basin, the water rippled, and a face appeared beneath the surface. Not Maeve. Not some ghostly specter. It was me. But not quite. This version of me looked older, worn, like she had walked through 1,000 storms and survived every one. Her eyes, my eyes, held the weight of endless stories. Before I could scream, the wind rose again, wrapping around me like an embrace. It didn't feel cold or cruel, it felt protective, guiding, calling. And then the ground beneath my feet shifted. I woke in a place I can't fully describe. The stars were closer, almost humming with light, and the trees. They weren't just trees. They were watching. Silent guardians, ancient and knowing. Their branches stretching toward the sky like frozen dancers mid-movement. The wind was alive here, moving with purpose, twisting through the trees like a living thing. I felt it wrap around my wrist gently, tugging me forward like an unseen guide. I walked for what felt like hours or maybe just moments. Time didn't seem to work the same way there. Finally, I reached another clearing, one far older and deeper than the one near Grandma's house. And she was there. Maeve. She stood at the edge of a crystal-clear pool, her dark hair braided with silver threads that caught the starlight. Her eyes were ancient but kind, glowing softly like embers in a long-dead fire. "You came," she said, her voice like wine through autumn leaves. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe, but somehow she understood. "I waited for you," she continued. "The wind told me you would come. That you were meant to." I wanted to ask what she meant, but before I could, she extended her hand. "You feel it, don't you? The pull, the calling. You've always heard it. You belong here." Her words unlocked something buried deep inside me. Something I'd felt my whole life but never understood. The wind had always whispered to me, calling me towards something just out of reach. This place. It was familiar, like coming home to a house I'd forgotten I'd lived in. I hesitated, staring at her outstretched hand. What happens if I stay?" Her gaze softened, almost sad. "You'll become part of the wind. A guardian. A guide." She paused, her voice lower now. "But you can't ever go back." I thought of Grandma Evelyn on her porch, her stories filled with longing and loss. Had she followed the wind once long ago and found her way back? Was that why she always seemed to know? I don't know how long I stood there, frozen between two worlds. But in the end, I took Maeve's hand. The moment our fingers touched, the wind rose again, wild and fierce, and I felt something deep inside me shift, like roots finally digging into the right soil. The stars pulsed brighter, and the forest seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries. I belonged. Years later, if you ever wander through the old hills of West Virginia, near the abandoned farmhouse with ivy-choked walls and a broken wind chime, listen carefully when the wind stirs the trees. Some say it's just the breeze rustling the leaves. But others, those who still believe in stories, will tell you something different. They'll say the wind is alive, still searching, still calling. And if you listen closely, you might just hear a voice calling your name.